by RQ and Pulp, and that might lead to resources that will never be freed again. Yeah, at the moment, this gives us the possibility to say whatever is set to be, or whatever is queued to be performed first on a resource is also done first on the resource. So this resource manager is basically serializing tasks, at least with respect to single resources. Yeah, due to the nature of the locking, it may be that one task is performing a very long living task and all other workers are waiting for the next task to be available. And yeah, I said that already, often cleanup can just block everything. So one very easy approach to locking is to say we don't need locking. And the question is, when do you need locking? There's like, do we have this here? No, I don't. I try to summarize the synchronization quadrant, which is if you have data, data can be mutable or data can be shared. And this gives you like 4 quadrants, where you have the quadrant where data is not shared and it's immutable and everything's okay. Then you have the quadrant where data is mutable but not shared, so only accessed by one processor, then there's no problem. Then you can go the other way, where you have your data to be immutable, then everyone can read it at the same time without a problem. No one is gonna write it ever. And the only problematic quadrant which we are in is the upper right one, where the data is mutable, shared. Then you need to synchronize, access, even read access to those objects.
Matthias, I need to interrupt briefly. I cannot take notes on your document because it says locked by owner. Only the owner can make edits. I was going to take them right into this doc.
Are you allowed now?
Not yet. Let me refresh, see if that does it. I'm online. I'm in lockless. No, it still says only the owner can edit this note. I can take notes in a different version if it'll, or just in a different doc, and then we'll put them in later. Why don't we do that?
Let me. First on the resource, so this resource manager is basically serializing tasks, at least.
See, this is exactly the problem. The lock is being held in one place.
To single resources.
Exactly. Lovely demo of the problem you're trying to describe here.
The lock is being held in one place.
To single resources.
Exactly.
I put the URL
lovely
to
demo of the problem you're trying to describe here.
The lock is being held in one place.
Right, single resources.
Exactly.
Lovely
demo. Okay, I got it. The problem you're trying to describe here.
The lock is being held in one place.
Right, single resources.
Exactly.
URL
Lovely demo. Okay. History's a thing.
The lock is being.
Yes, and so the idea is we can maybe improve on this situation a lot by not having mutable resources anymore. And the question is, how can we accomplish this? Yeah, so one question is, why do we have locking today? And one issue is we have the base path problem for distributions, so no distributions can distribute the same or different content in the same place, obviously. So we need to throw a big lock on this. I think this can be pushed back to a lock on the database level if the distribution can be created atomically. Yeah, then we have this FIFO property that whatever we want to do on a resource is performed in the same order. Then we have orphan cleanup, which really performs badly when done in parallel to another sync, because while the sync is running, some resources may look like. Then we have orphan cleanup, which really in a minute, which performs badly when done in parallel to another sync, because and then we have things like deletion of resources and updating while the sync is running. Some resources may look like already queued sync in a minute, and which performs badly. And the creation of repository versions is also serialized, and so that a repository can only get one at a time. So the idea I want to present here is that we want to try to make everything immutable, or almost everything. We will see that later. And the idea is if all resources were immutable, then they could be used by an unlimited number of processes at the same time without any need for synchronization primitives, which are usually called locks, but maybe should have been called bottlenecks in the first place. One thing I should note here is that we won't be without locking, because there is always some kind of locking, but we should try to rely on the locking that is already in the database. And obviously some levels below that, the processor does locking on memory, for example. So this locking free means we don't have locks in our code base. And once we have that, we obviously don't need a resource manager anymore, which is currently the only task that needs to be run at a singleton in Pulp. And that means all then remaining services will be absolutely scalable in a cluster sense. The contrasts obviously are, it's harder to design. If it were easier, we would have been in that situation in the first place. And another problem is it needs a new data model. So this is obviously not going to be Pulp 3, but probably a breaking change that is only valid if we bump the version once more. And to get the discussion started here, I want to present 3 possible solutions in short, which would be exposed immutability, so immutability. Yeah. So we say everything you put into Pulp is immutable from the moment you put it there, and there's no way to change anything. This is obviously the easiest one to do. We just delete all the update commands, and maybe it needs to be a little bit cautious about the delete commands. Problem is we put all burden to the user, and we make it practically impossible for a user to change something behind a natural key, which would be the name of a repository. So yeah, if he wants to change the description of a repository, the answer is no, he can't. Then there's another idea, which would be delayed immutability. So this is basically, we say the resource starts out in the quadrant where it is mutable but not shared. So it is owned by one worker until the worker finished its task, and then the resource hops over to the diagonal quadrant where it is immutable from then on, but can be shared across all of Pulp. This can maybe be combined with using the result of tasks as a kind of future, so that the user can say, once this task is finished, there will be a resource I can use for another task. Not sure how complicated that will be. There's some chat going on. Okay. Not about my name. But there was obviously a question about natural key. In Pulp, our resources usually have a UUID as a database key, but most of them can also be identified by, for example, a name, which I would call a natural key. And for example, in the case of a repository version, it's the combination of a name and a version. So then the natural key would be the name of the repository and the version number. So natural key is the more general term here. Yeah, futures would still be waiting on resources, so there is some blocking. And the problem would be the task may fail, and then the result of the future would still not be available as promised. I already said repository versions. Usually the syncing takes some time, and the result of a sync can obviously need not be saved in the database atomically. So in a way, repository versions already implement this model of delayed immutability, because once they are finished, we don't change them anymore. Yeah, and then there's a third model where we have a copy on write approach, a bit like objects are handled in the Linux kernel. That's where the inspiration came from, where you say you have a lookup table with natural keys that map to actual objects in another table. And where you say you have a natural keys that the table, and then you can switch the name atomically to a new immutable object. And the thing I see this would be that the user can only access the resources by their natural key, which is in this referencing database. And once that the user wants to perform a task, all the resources can be looked up by their database key, and the task now owns those objects, so they wouldn't be deleted in the meantime. And it is absolutely clear that he will work on the versions once the task was created. And the next thing is the task is immediately able to perform because there's no resource he needs to wait on. Yes. And the last thing I want to summarize here is that I think we can maybe combine the last two schemes in Pulp, because we have resources like content view versions, which kind of match to the future or delayed immutability. And we have objects that can basically be changed atomically, like repositories, remotes, and distributions that would, I think, perfectly match to the copy on write approach.
So the second proposal, futures, would this be a move away from having a system like RQ that runs separate tasks and like separate processes?
No. Actually, now that you say it, at the moment we have tasks both represented in the Pulp database and in RQ. which is part of the problem that those two informations can get out of sync. I believe you still need someone to coordinate your workers, but it's maybe that the tasks to be done are in the database and the next worker picks a task that is available.
Okay.
Does that answer the question?
I think so, yeah.
But
So I guess the proposal, sorry. I guess the proposal would be like we would have one queue, and then workers would pick off the next task on that queue. Rather than
or they are just pushed to the next, that they are just just put to the RQ queue. There's no the thing is that a task, once defined, is able to run at that very moment. So the next available worker can get it. So it can just be in a queue. And I think that is implemented in our queue, that you have one queue and 4 workers to pick their tasks from there.
Yep. So right now we have the initial queue the resource manager reads from. And instead of it just being the resource manager that reads from that queue, it would be all the workers reading from that queue.
Yes.
So right now we've got our code can rely on ordering because of that, because of the problem we're trying to solve. What it gives us is, I know that if I do a thing before you do a thing, then my stuff is going to be completed before yours is. And some of the things that need to happen in Pulp still need to be able to specify that kind of, I need to do these things in order. I need to have, the repo has to be created before the remote is created, before the sync can happen. How would that kind of processing be, how would that exist, I guess, in the lockless world?
The copy on write thing would be a atomic thing, so that wouldn't even trigger a task. So once you have the call to create a repository finished, you have the repository. So you can just take that repository and define the sync task with it.
Grant, I actually think that nothing would really change in that respect. My video is frozen. Can everyone still hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Because when you make a request to like sync a repository or do a publish, the view set will actually synchronously in that first request, like go look up whatever resource it was. So if you say, sync this repository with this remote, if that remote doesn't exist, it won't work at all. There's no delayed. So the way it currently is everything has to exist when you first make the API call.
Exactly.
How would so for version creation, let's say I'm adding units, and like today, for example, maybe in Catello, we make multiple calls to create 3 new versions, and we only really care about the newest one because we're like adding 3 batches of things. What would happen in this world?
So you say you trigger like 3 calls to change the repository version, or?
Yeah. So
well, it's possible to say you cannot start a new task that changes the repository content while one is running. And I think that's the only way to meet the requirement that every task can immediately start to run. So that would kind of push the locking back to the user. So the user must wait for the repository to be in a state where it can get the next sync action or add content action.
Justin, do you see a world where that's possible for the client to do the waiting?
I mean, it's definitely possible. More annoying, but possible.
So and I'm gonna ask questions here mostly because I'm having trouble wrapping my head around what this actually looks like. So if I'm asking questions that sound like I'm saying this is a terrible idea, that is not my thing at all. It's mostly my brain is terrible, not the idea. So I'm going to drill down a little bit on this, trying to figure out what this looks like from the user's point of view of Pulp 4 or Pulp N, whenever we would do this. I want to do what Justin's talking about. There's an existing repository. It has repository version 27. And I'm adding content to it in batches, let's say, because I have so many. So I'm going to add 100 units 3 times. And what I want at the end of that is all 300 units are in there, and I want to know what the version, I want to be working with the resulting version. Right now, I can say, I want to add, batch 1, batch 2, batch 3. They all get queued up, and the resource manager handles making sure that they get processed in order. And I'm going to, I can keep querying. I get the tasks back, and I can wait till that final task says it's complete, and then I can get the resulting version. That's the way we would do that currently. It's kind of fire and forget. You're just looking at the last task. In this context, the user would say, I want to create a new version and hand 100 units off to Pulp, and would immediately say, I want to create a new version. But before doing that, he'd have to say, is the repository ready to take more? Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And you could, go ahead. No, go ahead, Dennis.
Well, I was going to say an alternative solution to this is having an API that lets you specify these 300 units as 3 separate calls. The reason this is happening is because the size of the request is limited, and so you could have a separate API that lets you specify those units. So Pulp is already aware of all those 300 units, and then you have a call to add those to a repository version where you still have a single task that is actually handling it for you.
Sure. You still end up effectively though with the repository itself, whether I'm waiting or whether we tell Pulp, here's all of my stuff, and Pulp says, okay, I'm doing the thing that you asked me to, and somebody else says, oh, I want to add content to that repository. We still have that synchronization issue in there somewhere. So going lockless doesn't prevent us from doesn't allow us to ignore the fact that things have to happen in order, that order matters for a certain class of problem. And that's the thing I'm most having trouble getting my head around, is how do we guarantee order in the cases where order really, really matters? Like if I add a piece of content and then delete it, and I look, it's not there. If I delete the content before it exists, then I get an error because it isn't there, and I had it, and now it's there. And clearly those 2 states matter. How do we guarantee that is the thing I'm having trouble getting my head around.
Yeah. Actually, for adding and deleting content, it could just be made synchronously, because there's no waiting on external services involved. So it's content already in Pulp. It's more like I create a new version with that content. That may just be doable without a task even.
Right.
And at the moment, we need to make it a task because that's the only way to lock on it.
Right. Yeah. The other reason that we make it a task is to allow for the web server's timeout concerns. So sometimes some operations, like for instance, step solving, take longer than maybe even 5 minutes. So by running, that's one of the other motivations for us to run items in the background.
Yes. I mean, because there are going to, so there's like multiple levels of tasking involved here. And even if we were to do the lockless approach, Brian, I think we would still want to have the REST API behave the way it does now, where you make a request and you get a task back that says, this is what you can monitor to see when it's done, precisely because there's a web server in between that needs to be detached from waiting for the backend to do whatever it is it's doing. So that I don't think can go away in order to make this, to make Pulp work for the REST case. I'm just kind of grappling with, and it's, if I'm the single user, there's a set of problems that are relatively easy to solve. If I have 6 people all trying to affect the same repository, then they're all independent. It gets a lot more exciting about ordering and locking and making sure that happens.
And scheduling.
I guess scheduling is a whole thing. It's true. Well, that's just one of the users, right? I want to arrange for a sync to happen at midnight, whether that's an automated thing or whether somebody has to log on at midnight and push the button. It's still a third or another user rather than just me, whoever I am. Matthias, I'm assuming this is kind of on a tangent. I'm assuming there's lots of research here. Can you add to this document after we're done? Can you add links to like the way this works elsewhere? Because clearly you've got a lot of notes. If you could throw those originals in, that'd be great.
Mostly out of my head.
There is a video that Matthias could share.
Yeah, right. I will find something.
This problem, but it doesn't really provide a clear solution for our use case.
Okay.
It kind of gives a background on locks.
But I want to
try to Matthias summarize it very quickly.
Okay.
I want to take another turn on this. I want to schedule tasks one after another. At the moment, we have a situation where you can schedule a delete and then a sync to the same repository after that. Or you can schedule an update, and then the user looks up, the remote is at the right URL, and he schedules a sync, but the sync is scheduled after the update, and now it will sync from a different place. So I think most of the problems you just described are problems we already have.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So this first in, first out is not the solution to those, at least.
Can we talk about the update case? I'm trying not to focus completely on content. I know that all of us, that's the thing that we live in. So that's, but it's a specific use case. If there's an entity out there, the entity that exists in Pulp, and there's multiple users of this Pulp instance that all know about that entity, whatever it is, whether it's a repository or a user or a particular piece of content. Up above here, you talk about if we take the repository as a specific instance, it has a key. It has the UUID, but it also has the repository name or possibly name and type. We've talked about making those together be the key. But it also has a bunch of fields that are not the key. They're just things about the repo, as you described. Description is a good one.
I think the only one, but yes.
Yes. And when I think about similar content in like the Pulp RPM world, if you think about an update record, an erratum has a description. Yes. Technically, the description is not part of the key, but every time it changes, you have to know because you've now changed the thing that describes that. So there's a the update record has a hash that says this is the digest of everything in this update record, and that's the real key. You can change whatever you want, but this is the real key. Would we need to do something similar for every entity in order to be able to recognize that this is a new copy, a new thing?
I believe we already have content to be immutable. by design. So all of those are not the none of the concerns here. So whenever you upload a package to Pulp, it gets analyzed and it creates a content unit, and that will never be changed again.
Yep.
At least to my understanding. So this is really only, I mean, mostly about repositories, remotes, and distribution.
So we would need to figure out how to deal with those, correct? Is that
Exactly.
in this world? Okay.
So everything that's not already immutable by design.
Right. Right. So we are a ways down the path already to making this possible just because of some of the basic assumptions of Pulp is what I'm hearing, which is a good thing. Right.
Yeah,
A lot of the
yeah.
important stuff already is prepared to play in this world. Repo version is already prepared to play in this world. Did you change anything about the repo? Yes, you get a new repo version.
Exactly.
So this isn't a starting from scratch. This is how do we close all the windows? Is that correct?
That is correct. And one solution would obviously be if you have a repository, you cannot change its description anymore. But I think that's not a nice option. And so we will probably not focus on the first approach. It's just there for completeness.
And so can you talk a little bit more, and perhaps you already said this, but the combination of the last two approaches?
Yes, I think there are, or at least there's one resource, which is the repository version, which gets to the second approach. Exports maybe too, I don't know. While stuff like exporters, remotes, and repositories themselves do match the third approach best because they can be changed atomically. You say, I want a new description there, and you immediately get the answer. While all tasks that still access that repository will work with the old version. And once a real object is not referenced anymore by a name or a task, it can be deleted.
And would this delete occur whenever something is removing the reference? And I know I'm talking about implementation here, but.
Yeah, either that or some kind of garbage collection.
Okay.
But this kind of garbage collection doesn't need the big lock on everything because it can just pick up what is left over. And everything that is in Pulp that is still used is referenced by something.
Yeah, and these references are basically foreign keys in tables.
Yes, in some way.
And once it has no reference, it can never be referenced again, right?
Yes. At least from the outside, it cannot be looked up again because it has no name attached. And the other thing that can reference it is a task, and that might go unfinished.
What will the user experience when, say, they change the remote URL and issue a sync, and there's still the old one and the copied new one, and the sync is in progress, and say there's a few users in the system? Are there concerns about understanding what's going on in terms of what will this sync produce? What would another sync produce? When you look at the state of that thing that was changed, what are you shown?
Well, this has come up before. This is not going to help with any audit tool. Auditing should be done elsewhere. So if you want to know who changed my repository at which point in time, that's a different question. Well, you trigger the sync by specifying the remote by its name. And at that time, the name will be looked up, and whatever the remote tells you at that time will be used in the sync. That's the idea. So if you change the remote and trigger the sync immediately after that, there's a high chance that you get what you just changed. If that answers your question. If you have another administrator in your system and he's trying to, and he's interfering with your work, then you're in trouble today, and you will be in trouble with this solution.
So what I'm hearing, Matthias, is that RBAC is going to save us from this.
If done correctly, or let's say if implemented, if you trust all your administrators. And I think this is the user experience with almost all systems where you have access for multiple users. If someone changes something for everyone, then it's changed. And if you don't want them, don't give them the rights.
So the confusion factor of I changed it and then I read the entity and it's different than what I changed it to because you changed it and one, in some sense, it came afterwards, is going to happen regardless. Whether you're using no locking or locking.
That's a race condition in any place, in both ways, yeah.
Yeah,
and
but we handle that problem differently today. I mean, we don't really have this problem today because the asynchronous updates, all the updates being asynchronous, they are all linearized, and so. Yes, so while two users can race to set something, the system still preserves their first come first serve order, and at any time when you read, if user A dispatches a task and user B dispatches a task and state of thing being changes the sync URL, at any time, everyone can look at the remote that would be used and know, well, my sync hasn't happened yet. It's gonna use this one.
Actually, if the second update hasn't happened too, then you can look now and see what the sync will not use. So it can be that the other update that changes it to the wrong URL and the sync are still queued. And now you look and think, well, my sync will run properly, and then it gets updated and the sync starts. It's just, we have another window for the race condition at the moment.
They just look different. This is making my head hurt. And this is, again, that's not this is a bad design problem. That's a thinking about concurrent problems like this are always painful. And I'm trying to get the visualization set in my head.
And I'm trying to say that this is not a problem we will introduce here, or we would introduce with this.
Yeah, there's always this race condition between the user doing a read to see what the information is right now versus when a certain task runs in the future and what the information will be then.
And the only way to handle that would be to give the lock to the user. Ouch. So that you say, I'm going to have the access on this resource until I'm finished syncing, and then I give it back.
The user, not the resource manager, but the individual who has a, and I'm going to go down this path just a bit to get it set in my head. That would be along the lines of there's an API where a user, the external to Pulp user says, I am locking repository X. Exactly. And he gets back a, okay, you, the user, are now holding it. And now the user can do whatever he wants. And if a second user says, I want to update repository X, he's told to go fish because somebody else has it locked. So and then if user A never comes back, then everything falls over and you have to restart Pulp because it's holding locks.
No. Well, the idea is that you don't actually hand the lock to the user. It's just that operation while it's running, it has the lock on it. And nothing else can get in line to get that lock until that lock is released automatically.
I see. But that's still subtly different than what we're doing today. It's a more exposed lock. Okay.
Yeah. By the way, time check, we have 5 minutes.
Oh, goodness.
I wanted to mention something, and this probably will not be a popular opinion. But as a heavy user of Pulp 3, I would maybe ask that you look at the problems that you had specified that are leading you in this direction. And like, I get that the solutions here definitely solve those, and that's great. They're large changes with maybe some not fully understood consequences for users. But things like orphan cleanup, like that's a big problem. I get that that's a big problem. Resource manager existing maybe is like more of a medium problem. Orphan cleanup makes it worse. And then there's kind of a lot of other small problems that I feel like maybe are more perceived problems than actually like user reported issues, which as developers, we try to anticipate. So I guess, my suggestion is maybe try to figure out if there's a solution for the big problem that doesn't involve a giant change from the user's perspective, and I'm not saying don't, go to a lockless Pulp, but maybe in the more medium term, there's a solution that doesn't break all the users in very subtle ways, but actually solves the majority of the issue. And if there's not, then that's fine too.
Yeah, and
what I hear is orphan cleanup needs to be changed maybe anyway.
Yeah, and this is a conversation that we've been having in IRC a little bit, and we've talked about this a little bit before Matthias as well. And orphan cleanup is a big problem, and so is the resource manager is a medium problem. I think that's graded correctly. And I didn't want to take away from the content and preparation for this session because it's a conversation in and of itself. But if we're considering solutions for those problems, there are other options aside from the ones written here. And for example, we could allow for orphan cleanup to not stop all other tasks, and orphans could be cleaned up either periodically, and that's a task that runs in parallel, or as needed, so that the last reference to a particular orphan content unit deletes it. That's the ref count garbage collection strategy. In both of those cases, the architecture would be that you wouldn't have an orphan cleanup operation anymore because orphans just get cleaned up on its own. Pulp just handles that. And really, to make that happen, why wouldn't we do that right away? To make that happen, what we would need to do is we would need to have better error handling in places where anytime that you, in your plugin or Pulp core code, you check for a piece of content in the database, and then moments later you go to associate that comment in the database. So for example, in the Stages API, the Stages API queries the database and says, oh, I have content 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 30 seconds later, it actually goes to associate content unit 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh wait, someone deleted it in between. So if we could address that error recovery, which would be to recreate the content unit, download it, something like that, or perhaps we just delay the deletes so that they're around still for some amount of reasonable expected time to just avoid the missing content. then that's a way to solve that problem as well. And there's another solution that I think is pretty straightforward for the resource manager to eliminate it completely, but for the sake of time, I will tell you all about that at a later session.
I want to add the resource manager may be a bit more than a medium problem, because in my opinion, it's the reason for the hanging tasks we have experienced with the Celery as well as with RQ now.
And we can talk about a pretty straightforward way about how we can eliminate the resource manager as well. In fact, it's so easy, even though we're at our time, I'll tell you now. It would be to use etcd, which will give us all workers a consistent data store, and you save the locks that things would be needed in the database. Oh wait, we do that already. And instead of routing something to the resource manager to then be routed to a worker, workers are able to use the consistent view to determine which worker is owning which locks. And you would only have workers, you wouldn't have a resource manager, and we would still process tasks in the same order we do today.
So the question for some of these, like let's say we get rid of resource manager, that doesn't change the public API. Is that a Pulp 3.x thing, or is that a Pulp 4 level change?
I think 3. Because it's a significant improvement, and it does come with a change, but it's that's my take on it.
I mean, to Justin's point of users of Pulp are going to recognize that there are some things that could really stand to be cleaned up now, as opposed to with a redesign. Now, some of that might just be we address it and we release it as the next 3.x release, or we can address that by saying, yes, there's going to be a Pulp 4. It has some really significant changes, but the move from 3 to 4 isn't going to be 4 years from now, and the migration isn't going to be any harder than updating from 3.10 to 3.12. But that's all discussion to be had in terms of how maybe it'll factor into Dennis's major releases and how we make that happen. But I think Justin's point, I'm going to reinforce Justin's point, is that there are problems that we already know that are problems because we already have real users reporting them as problems that we'd like to be able to solve without having to completely redesign the guts of Pulp 3. And how can we do that is definitely a good question to ask.
Cool. We're at our time.
Okay.
And perhaps we should schedule another session. I know that there was another slot.
I'd say at this point, thank you for the discussion. It was very good and helpful. And I'm going to stop recording at this moment then. And stop streaming too, I guess.
Brian, I think you can stop streaming for now too.
All right.
Start with the Xorg versus Wayland. You're muted right now, Brian.
Hey, I'm muted. I'm going to try to get this fixed.
Cool.
All right.
Yeah,
so,
when I was using OBS, I had to switch.
I am slightly weirded out about the usage of etcd now. Like, what led to that?
Yeah, so
we're not using it now.
Yep.
But the discussion. Go ahead, Brian. Sorry.
Yeah, so really, there are questions about why you would even use a tool like that and what would it do for us. So what I think we should do is try to find a dedicated slot in our agenda to talk about it rather than to try to quick talk it through here. But to your concern level, Neil, and I appreciate you saying this, and Ina is also saying this in chat as well. And Daniel's also asking about this as well. So no decisions have been made, and we should talk it over.
I mean, even if we...
etcd is a little scary to deploy and manage as it is. So like, I don't know if there's a good enough reason for what Pulp typically is used for to necessitate etcd complexity. So,
Yep.
we just got away from MongoDB, and I don't know if we want to go from one trash heap to another.
The best comment ever.
Yeah. Well, let's find. Let me look at the schedule here. What's our open slot? When's our open slot?
So we have slot on Thursday, I believe. But I suggest maybe we can create a list. It's like the first topic today, and we already want a follow-up discussion. So maybe we need like a list of things we would like to have follow-ups, and then we'll pick what we'll discuss on Thursday.
Because quite honestly, I expected this discussion, because I think it's hugely valuable, and I'm really interested in seeing if I can get my brain to grok this. One more 48, 50-minute session is not going to be enough. If we decide to go down this path, this is going to take a lot of design work and understanding where it's coming from. There's going to be a lot of pounding to happen here. So even if we decide not to discuss this at PulpCon this week, we absolutely want to have a spin-off SIG or something that says, how can we do this? Because I think it's going to take that level of effort to figure out the right ways to do it. Yeah, does that make sense?
Absolutely.
I think so. Yeah, if we decide that this is a road that we're going to go down, then we probably really need to be very careful and cognizant of how we're doing it and why. I just, that kind of threw a red flag for me. I was like, wait, what? We just got away from a complicated, annoying database, and we're suggesting to use another one?
Indeed.
I mean, hell, one of the reasons that we're even at work, we're even seriously considering rolling out Pulp is because it doesn't use weird, scary, complicated technologies anymore to actually like manage and deploy. It's everything that everybody understands and can scale and deal with. That was the reason we didn't do Pulp 2 before, and I wound up handwriting my own system, which sucks, but is better than dealing with the MongoDB. So,
Interesting.
and etcd is even less understood than MongoDB, and MongoDB is pretty crap in its own right. So, like, I would caution the idea of using it unless you've got a really, really compelling reason and don't have any other way of doing it.
Then let's put it on a topic for Thursday.
Yeah. Let's I wonder. Do we have a document where we can just include stuff like that?
We can just make the list, I think, under here.
Under where?
Just as a general question, because I know nothing about etcd apart from like the 2 lines I saw on their website a couple minutes ago. Like, what does it even do different than Redis does? Because I guess they're both key value stores, and we've already got Redis.
Yeah, so since it's asked here, etcd, complicated though it may be, implements a data view consistent view of key value stores, which is a key difference and something that's really difficult to get right. So if you're familiar with algorithms like Paxos and Raft, those are underlying research-based algorithms that provide features like a leader election, so that all nodes in a cluster can understand who has acquired a particular lock. And in a distributed system without a single component running things, that's a very difficult problem to solve, actually. And so from a high level, its feature set seems quite simple and blasé, but underneath, it's actually providing you leader election and a data view consistent with data with guarantees. which even correctly handle cases like net splits and one or two node isolation, and having those nodes preventing them from thinking that they're the master. So you actually have two separate isolated masters. But to Neil's point, you could also store all that database in Postgres. Postgres acts as kind of a central authority in that sense. And that's definitely a viable option as well. That's more like us kind of reinventing what they already do, but that's maybe a better option. That's possible. That's definitely possible.
I think that's kind of closer to the outbox pattern that I mentioned the other day.
So the thing that makes me a little confused is I don't know what you need the leader election at Raft consensus protocol stuff for specifically, because typically in a Pulp deployment, at least the ones that I've been POCing and looking at, it's you already have your Postgres server, far and away, and everything that from the Pulp system, and every time you're doing actions, it's already going back to Postgres and doing either identifying the stuff or whatever. And since Postgres supports simultaneous connections, unless you're doing something absolutely batshit crazy, like importing EPEL 5 times at once, you typically don't run into any issues of that nature. And with the queuing and all the other stuff that goes on using RQ, you don't even run it. You can't even really run into that case because everything is serialized as it's being processed. So I guess I don't understand what you would get from having that.
So I'm gonna step in here because it's already a minute after 10, and I hate stepping on important discussions, but etcd is a really low level. We've decided to do this, and we're figuring out the technology we're going to use discussion. Absolutely needs to happen, but this needs to be its own thing, yeah. And we need to give Dennis a chance to pitch his thing for how are we going to manage releases. Can someone? I'm just adding notes under the Lightning Talks link that Brian pointed as miscellaneous under other topics. But it feels like what I would like is somebody to take an action item to decide where to have this exact discussion, whether it's just Matthias and Brian and Neil, getting together in a meeting, or on the mailing list is probably the best place to start so that other people can see it who might want to join in. But this is great discussion. I'd just like to see it happen somewhere where we can concentrate on it.
Thank you, Grant.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to start recording the meeting. Cool. So we want to figure out some processes for how we're going to develop